The hunting party had already departed by the time Veth Sokar filed the formal denial, which meant that technically, procedurally, and according to every rule the Kaldrathi Conclave had written into their colonial charter over the past 400 years, the matter was resolved. The human had asked. The council had considered. The council had declined. End of record. Veth Sokar had served as conclave liaison to Outrider Station for 11 standard months, and in that time she had handled 17 such requests from the human garrison contingent, requests for extended patrol radius, requests for expanded weapons authorization, requests to reclassify the surrounding Veth marshland as an active combat zone rather than a protected ecological preserve. Every single one had been denied by a council that regarded human enthusiasm for engagement the way one might regard an enthusiastic fire. Technically useful, absolutely not to be placed near anything you valued, Veth Sokar had delivered each denial personally. She had become quite accomplished at it. She maintained a small folder of them on her liaison data system organized by category, and the folder had grown to the point that she had needed to create subcategories: weapons, territorial, ceremonial, access, and a miscellaneous grouping. She privately labeled optimism, which contained the more creative requests. The petition to designate the garrison gymnasium as a secondary command post, the formal appeal for expanded live-fire exercises within the ecological preserve's southern buffer zone, the request from a corporal named Torres to be permitted to keep what the petition described as a small local animal in the garrison barracks, with 3 paragraphs of attached documentation on the animal's temperament and a hand-drawn diagram of the proposed containment structure. She was not without sympathy for the garrison's situation. Outrider Station was a frontier posting, mineral extraction focus, a long way from anything the humans thought of as interesting, and the garrison contingent of 41 soldiers had been here for 9 months with another 14 to go. They had very little to do beyond regular patrols of the station's outer perimeter and the kind of administrative work that soldiers on quiet postings generated in proportion to their boredom, which was considerable. The Kaldrathi colonial population of 4,000 were largely indifferent to them, as colonial populations tended to be toward garrison units that had no obvious immediate utility, and the surrounding landscape. 300 kilometers of low marshland, drainage basin, and reed-dense floodplain offered very little by way of distraction unless one had a specific interest in the Rethval migration, the seasonal waterbird colonies, or the particular quality of silence that marshland produced at night, which was its own kind of oppressive. The request that had come in 4 days prior had been different in its specificity, though not in her assessment of the outcome. The human staff sergeant, a woman named Nadia Vasquez, had submitted a formal petition requesting that 1 human soldier be included in the Kaldrathi Grand Hunt, a cultural tradition occurring every 6 years when the Rethval migration brought the great herd animals through the Veth marshland's deep basin, and when a trained party of Kaldrathi hunters tracked and culled the diseased and weakened from the margins of the herd to maintain ecological balance. The hunt was ceremonial. It was sacred. It involved bladed weapons only, per tradition, and it lasted anywhere from 3 days to 8, depending on how difficult the terrain proved. The council's seasonal naturalist had briefed the conclave on the hunt's requirements twice in the past month, and those briefings had been attended by most of the senior council members, who had listened with the attentive care that Kaldrathi brought to ecological matters of long tradition. The petition had been 4 paragraphs long and had used the phrase cultural exchange opportunity twice. It had included, attached, a single-page overview of the petitioner's environmental fieldwork experience, formatted in the human military style that compressed significant information into dense blocks of text and appeared to assume the reader had no time for sentences longer than necessary. Veth Sokar had read it, found it well organized and professionally argued, and denied it anyway, noting politely that the hunt was closed to non-Kaldrathi participants as a matter of ancestral protocol, and that the garrison's assistance was neither requested nor required. Staff Sergeant Vasquez had acknowledged receipt of the denial with a brief, professionally worded message. The matter had been closed. That was what Veth Sokar had believed until the third day of the hunt, when the hunting party returned. 17 Kaldrathi hunters, lean and exhausted and smelling of the marshland's particular combination of standing water and root rot, and found Nadia Vasquez already at the eastern camp, seated on an equipment crate, eating a ration bar and reading something on a small data pad. She had not been following them. That was the first thing Ganthala, the huntmaster, established in the immediate and not entirely calm conversation that followed. The human had entered the marshland alone from the western approach 2 days after the official party departed, and had conducted what she described with a flatness that Veth Sokar found deeply troubling in retrospect as independent fieldwork. She had not taken a Kaldrathi blade. She had carried standard garrison equipment, and she had, at some point during those 2 days, located, tracked, and marked 11 Rethval for culling, 11 animals that the hunting party, with 17 trained specialists and 4 days of effort, had not yet found. Ganthala had not immediately reported this to Veth Sokar. He had first stared at the marks on the human's field map for a very long time, then asked several questions to which he received answers he apparently found unsatisfying, then summoned Veth Sokar from her office with a message that read simply, "There is a situation." This was not phrasing Ganthala used lightly. He was a hunter in the old tradition, lean-jawed and patient with the subdued secondary dermis coloration of a Kaldrathi who had spent his adult life in low-light terrain, and he was not a person given to the description of things as situations. The eastern camp occupied a raised platform of packed earth and prefabricated panels at the edge of the basin's first drainage ridge, and it smelled of the hunting party's dried provisions and the particular mineral sharpness of the marshland air, which was different from the station air in the way that all outdoor air on this world was different, heavier, fuller, with an undertone of standing water and the mold bloom that colonized the undersides of the reed mats every wet season. Veth Sokar had never found marshland air comfortable. She was a Kaldrathi whose formative years had been spent in the dry highlands of Kalth Prime, where the air was thin and clean and smelled of mineral dust and altitude, and the Veth marshland's persistent wetness had been a low-grade sensory irritant since her first day on Outrider Station. She had adapted. She had not come to like it. Veth Sokar arrived to find 13 of the 17 hunters present, all in various states of controlled agitation that manifested as too still posture and the particular flat eye expression Kaldrathi used when their threat processing centers were active, but their social training was actively suppressing physical response. Vel Karan, the youngest of the party and the hunter who had been sent to verify the drainage cut, was seated apart from the others with his field kit in his lap, doing nothing with it. He had the look of someone who had returned from a verification task and found the results sufficiently unexpected that they were still processing. The other hunters were clustered in the loose groupings that professional Kaldrathi used in ambiguous social situations, close enough to confer, far enough apart to have not yet decided whether to confer. The human sat in the middle of this arrangement with her ration bar and her data pad and no particular expression at all. She was smaller than Veth Sokar had expected from the official garrison file. The garrison file listed her at 1.63 meters, which was unremarkable for a human woman, but the effect of encountering that height in the middle of a camp of Kaldrazi hunters, none of whom stood under 2.1 meters, and most of whom massed 3 times what the human did, was to make her compactness feel like a choice rather than a limitation. She had brown hair pulled back in a functional knot. Her garrison jacket had a darkened patch at the left elbow from repeated contact with abrasive surface, and the jacket's right sleeve had been rolled to the midpoint of the forearm in the casual way humans managed temperature regulation, which Veth Sokar had learned to read as a sign of comfort rather than carelessness. Her boots had 4 days of marshland mud on them, despite the fact that she had ostensibly only been in the basin for 2. Veth Sokar noted that and filed it, uncertain what to do with it. She had the stillness of someone at rest rather than someone waiting. The kind of stillness that suggested she had already finished any internal negotiation about how this conversation was going to go and was simply waiting for it to begin. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," Veth Sokar said. The human looked up from her data pad. The expression she offered was professionally neutral, which Veth Sokar recognized as the face humans wore when they had calculated exactly how much trouble they were in and had decided the calculation was acceptable. "Liaison Sokar." A brief nod. "I figured you'd come out." Veth Sokar had prepared a short, precise address about the nature of the denial, the sanctity of Kaldrathi ceremonial tradition, the jurisdictional boundaries that governed garrison personnel activity in the preserve, and the documentation she intended to file regarding this incident. She delivered approximately the first third of it before Genthala, who had been standing to her left with the stillness of a hunting post, raised one hand and said, in a tone of considerable control, "Liaison. The map." The map was spread on the central camp table. It was a real paper Kaldrathi field chart of the basin, the kind the hunt used by tradition because data pads were prone to moisture failure in extended marshland conditions, and paper was not overlaid with the hunting party's track marks in red. 4 days of careful work, methodical sweeps, observation posts, recorded sightings that represented the accumulated expertise of 17 hunters who had between them nearly 400 years of combined marshland experience. And laid over that, in the blue stylus marks the human had applied when she returned to camp, were 11 small circles, each annotated with a set of coordinates, a description of the animal's presentation. Gait, irregularities, dermis discoloration, respiratory rate, and an estimated timestamp for when the marking had been made. The handwriting was small and precise, the notations abbreviated in a system Veth Sokar did not recognize, but which was internally consistent, each entry following the same format: location, presentation indicator, confidence rating, timestamp, clinical, efficient. The record of someone who had been taught to document field observations in a specific way and had never stopped doing it. 9 of the 11 marks fell in terrain the hunting party had not yet reached. 2 of them fell in areas the party had passed through and found empty. "Those 2, Veth Sokar said, pointing. "Your party assessed this quadrant on day 2. You found no presenting animals." "We found none," Genthala said. His voice was careful. "She found 2, resting in a drainage cut below the primary sight line." He paused. "I sent Velkaran back to verify. Both animals are there. Both are presenting the symptom pattern she marked." The marshland made a sound around them, water and wind and the distant percussion of something large moving through the outer reeds, and Veth Sokar stood looking at the map for a moment that stretched longer than she intended. Staff Sergeant, she said eventually. The conclave denial was explicit. It was, the human agreed. You were informed that the hunt was a closed ceremonial tradition. I was. And yet you entered the preserve. The human set her datapad down. She did it slowly, not as a gesture of submission, but in the way a person sets something down when they are about to use both hands for something else, which in this case appeared to be holding Veth Sokar's gaze with a steadiness that the liaison found difficult to categorize as either defiance or indifference. It sat somewhere between those two things and did not shift toward either. I entered the preserve on a public access path, Vasquez said. Garrison personnel have unrestricted access to the Veth marshland under the Outrider Station Joint Territorial Agreement, Section 9, Subsection 4. The hunt is a restricted ceremonial event. The marshland itself is not. Veth Sokar opened her mouth. Genthala made a short sound that was not quite a word. You brought your own equipment, the huntmaster said. He had turned from the map and was watching the human with an expression Veth Sokar had never seen on him before, which troubled her because she had known Genthala for 11 years and had believed she was familiar with his range. Standard garrison kit, Vasquez said. Observation scope. Field kit, data log. No Kaldrathi ceremonial blades. I wasn't hunting. You marked 11 animals for culling. I marked 11 animals presenting health indicators consistent with your culling criteria. That's observation. I didn't touch any of them. She paused. I did take some notes. Genthala looked at Veth Sokar. The look contained a question the liaison did not feel equipped to answer in the moment, so she redirected. The garrison file on you, Veth Sokar said. It lists your previous posting as Keller's Rock. 18 months. Keller's Rock is a logistics depot. It is now. It was a contested extraction site for the first 6 of those 18 months. A brief pause. The garrison file probably notes that period as pre-stabilization operations. We called it something else. Veth Sokar had read the file carefully before the denial. Keller's Rock had been reclassified from an active engagement zone to a logistics depot following a period of sustained irregular conflict with Skryth incursion units. The transition had taken, per the file, approximately 7 months. She had not spent significant time on that section of Vasquez's record because it had not seemed relevant to a petition regarding a ceremonial hunt. It seemed somewhat more relevant now. She spent some time on it now mentally and found that her recalibration was producing results she had not anticipated. The Skryth incursion on Keller's Rock, she said slowly. That was marshland terrain. Most of it. River delta with heavy reed cover. The human picked up her ration bar. Not unlike this basin, actually. Different biomarkers, same sightline problem. You can't clear it from height. You have to be in it. You spent 6 months in delta terrain. Longer, if you count the 8 months before Keller's Rock. Prior posting was a river margin installation on Heron's Reach. Similar situation. Different enemy pattern. She bit into the ration bar. I've been in wetland operational environments for just under 4 years. Total. It's kind of my thing. One of the hunters near the camp table's edge, a tall woman named Vel Sarek, who served as the party's second tracker, made a sound that was not quite a word. Her secondary dermis had gone the pale ochre that indicated sustained processing of unexpected information. She had been standing very still since before Veth Sokar arrived and had said nothing during the entire exchange, and the small, involuntary sound was apparently what came out when her restraint met its limit. How many engagements? Velsarak said. It was not exactly addressed to anyone. It appeared to be a question she had been holding and had run out of room to keep holding. Vasquez looked at her. Total? Keller's Rock was 47 separate contact events over 6 months. Heron's Reach was 32 over 8 months. There were some others. She paused, not with hesitation, but with the brevity of a person deciding how much context is actually useful. The numbers themselves aren't the point. The point is that you learn the terrain. You learn it in a way that stops being conscious. After the first year, the wetland just reads to you. Wind, water movement, where the sight lines break, where the sound carries, and where it doesn't. You stop thinking about it and start feeling it. Velsarak's dermis shifted again. She looked at Genthala, who was looking at the map. The camp was very quiet. 13 Kaldrathi hunters, a huntmaster and Veth Sokar, stood in various arrangements of stillness around a camp table, bearing a map that now contained an argument none of them had walked in prepared to hear. The marshland made its sounds at the edges. Water, reed percussion, the distant call of something nesting in the upper basin. Genthala picked up the map. He held it with both hands, the Kaldrathi hunting assessment posture, and studied the blue marks for a long time. Veth Sokar watched him and did not speak, because she had known him long enough to recognize when he was thinking rather than hesitating, and those two conditions required entirely different responses. These two, he said finally, indicating the marks in the already surveyed quadrant. The drainage cut animals. My party assessed that ground and found nothing. Your party assessed from the main drainage channel, Vasquez said. Standard approach. The cut runs perpendicular and drops below the ambient water line by about 1.5 meters at the far end. You'd have to go into it to see the far section. We would have smelled them. Wind was moving south-southwest at around 2 meters per second during your Day 2 survey. It would have carried your scent into the cut before your sightline reached it. The animals would have been still and low. She paused. They were still low when I found them. I came at the cut from the far end, north approach, working into the wind. Genthala set the map down. You approached into the wind, he said, deliberately. Standard wetland observation protocol. You don't want your scent moving ahead of you when you're trying to locate animals that are trying to avoid predators. She finished the ration bar. Or when you're the predator. Depending. There was a silence that lasted long enough to become uncomfortable in a way Veth Sokar had not experienced in a professional capacity in some years, and she was a person who regularly mediated between species with meaningful cultural incompatibilities. Staff Sergeant, she said, I need to understand something. Vasquez looked at her. You were denied. I was. And yet you went anyway. Not in violation of any specific provision, Veth Sokar added, because it was accurate and because she believed in accuracy even when it was inconvenient, but in direct contravention of the Council's expressed wishes regarding human participation. I didn't participate in the hunt. You located 11 animals that the Hunt Master's party was seeking. I found 11 animals in a marshland where I was conducting observation fieldwork. I shared the data. The human's expression was still neutral, still exactly calibrated to that difficult point between defiance and indifference. And Veth Sokar found she could not decide whether it was a performance or simply the natural resting state of a person who had long since stopped being surprised by the gap between institutional declarations and operational realities. Liaison Sokar. When the Council denied my petition, what reason did they give? Veth Sokar had written the denial herself. The hunt is a closed Kaldrathi ceremonial tradition not open to non-Kaldrathi participants. Human soldiers are outside the cultural tradition it preserves, and their inclusion would alter the practice's ceremonial integrity. Right, Vasquez nodded slowly. Did the denial say anything about walking in a marshland? The silence that followed was brief, and the answer was no. I did not hunt, Vasquez said. I didn't carry Kaldrathi blades. I didn't participate in the ceremony. I walked in a marshland that I am legally authorized to enter, and I used skills that 4 years of wetland operational duty gave me, and I wrote down what I saw. She looked at Genthala. What you do with that information is entirely up to you. Genthala had been watching this exchange with the stillness of a person who had heard something they expected to need to think about for a considerable period. He was a large person by any applicable standard, and he made very little sound when he moved and when he turned to Veth Sokar. Now the expression on his face was one she had not seen there before. Something adjacent to the look a hunter wore when they crested a rise and found the terrain they had been reading from tracks was, in fact, shaped exactly the way the tracks had implied. The 2 animals in the drainage cut, he said. My party would have doubled back to that quadrant tomorrow. You would have found them, Vasquez said. She said it without qualification, as a statement of simple fact, the way one confirms that water flows downhill. Eventually. Probably tomorrow. Maybe the day after, depending on how the herd moved. And the other 9 marks. Northwest Basin, 3rd Ridge System. The migration is pushing the weakened animals to the outside of the herd for predator management. They're moving in a loose line along the base of the 3rd ridge and resting in the hollow below the 4th drainage point. You'll find the concentration there. She paused. I go early. First light, wind out of the west, approach from the high ground on the north end. Genthala was quiet. Then he said, How long did it take you? 2 days, Vasquez said. 11 animals. The hunt master's secondary dermis shifted, just slightly just at the jawline, the Kaldrathi involuntary response to information that required significant reassessment. He had been conducting this hunt, or variations of it, for 21 years. He had never, in Veth Sokar's observation of him, made that particular expression in response to information from outside his own party. Your party, Vasquez said, is good at this. I want to be clear about that. 17 trained hunters, 4 days in, and you've been reading the terrain correctly. You just don't have the specific sightline adaptations for below-ambient drainage work. She said this the way a person states a technical limitation of a piece of equipment. Not a criticism, simply an observable parameter. Humans evolved for wetland hunting, specifically for the ambush and track pattern in low visibility, high cover terrain. We're built for it in ways that took about 2 million years to develop and that I don't entirely take credit for. 2 million years, Genthala said, give or take. The wetland hunting adaptation is older than most of what we think of as human civilization. We were doing this before we had language to talk about doing it. She looked at the map. 4 years of operational training on top of that is less relevant than it sounds. I mostly learned to not get in the way of what my nervous system already knows how to do. The camp breathed around them, and Veth Sokar stood in the middle of it, trying to decide which aspect of the situation she was most obligated to address first. The jurisdictional question was the easiest and also the least important, and she was honest enough with herself to recognize that order of priority. The harder question was the one sitting in the center of the camp table in blue stylus marks, which was the question of what the conclave had actually denied when it had denied the petition 4 days ago. She had written that denial. She had believed it was correct. She still believed, in the architectural sense, that the reasoning had been internally sound. The hunt was ceremonial. The ceremony was Kaldrathi. Non-Kaldrathi participation altered it. That logic remained intact. What had changed was her understanding of what participation meant, which was a small and significant distinction, and which had been demonstrated to her not through argument but through 2 days of fieldwork and 11 blue circles on a paper map. The conclave had denied Nadia Vasquez the right to carry a blade among Kaldrathi hunters into the Rethval Basin, to follow the ceremonial track, to stand at the culling point and make the kills that the tradition prescribed. That was the denial. The denial had not anticipated a human who would decline to do any of those things and instead walk alone into 300 kilometers of marshland, navigate by wine reading and sightline assessment, and whatever instinct 4 years of wetland operational fieldwork had built into her nervous system, and return with a field report that was functionally more useful than 4 days of organized ceremonial effort. Veth Sokar had a specific thought briefly about the corporal named Torres who had submitted the 3-paragraph petition to keep a small local animal in the garrison barracks. She suspected now that humans made that kind of petition not because they expected approval, but because the act of asking was itself a form of communication, a signal that said, "We are here. We are engaged with what is around us. We are not simply waiting." The denial, in each case, was also a kind of communication. It said, "We have considered your engagement and found it outside our parameters." And in each case, apparently, the human had heard that communication, and then done whatever they were going to do anyway, within the narrowest available definition of compliance. "You're going to file a report," Vasquez said. It was not a question. "I am. And you're going to note that I entered the preserve in a legal capacity, shared observational data on a voluntary basis, and did not participate in the hunt in any ceremonial or procedural sense." "I will note all of those things accurately, yes." "Then that's probably fine." She stood, stretched in the loose-limbed way humans did when they had been seated for a while, several of the joints in her spine making sounds that caused 2 of the nearby hunters to shift weight involuntarily. "I'm sorry I worried you. That wasn't the intention." "What was the intention?" Veth Sokar said. Vasquez paused. The question seemed to actually land on her, which was different from the flat affect she had maintained through most of the preceding conversation. She looked at the map one more time, at the red marks and the blue marks layered over each other. 4 days of Kaldrathi expertise in careful systematic arcs, and 2 days of something that had proceeded on different principles and arrived at different answers. "You asked me not to come," she said. "That was your right. I'm not trying to argue that. The hunt is yours, and I understand that." A pause. "But there was a thing happening in that marshland that I knew how to help with, and I had to do something with that. I couldn't just sit in the garrison and know that I could help and not." She looked at Veth Sokar. "Does that make sense?" It was not quite a question. Veth Sokar thought about 11 Kaldrathi hunters who had contracted the wasting sickness during the hunt that had occurred 12 years ago, when a diseased cohort within the Rethval herd had been missed during the culling assessment and the infection had spread laterally through the remaining population before the party identified the source. She remembered that hunt because Genthala had lost his apprentice to the follow-on disease exposure. A young hunter named Vel Sorath, whose name was carved on the eastern camp post, as was traditional for hunters lost in the marshland. Vel Sorath had been 18 years old. She had been in training for 3 years and had, by all accounts shown the kind of particular quiet talent for reading terrain that the best Kaldrathi trackers developed. Not learned, exactly, but cultivated from something that was already there. The wasting sickness had taken her in 9 days, which was faster than the medical record suggested it should have. The huntmaster had never said much about it to Veth Sokar because he was not a person who said much about things he had integrated. But she had seen him stand at that post for a while, twice in the years she had known him. She thought about 11 blue circles on a paper map. It makes a certain kind of sense, she said carefully. We don't ask permission to be useful, Vasquez said. Humans. It's not arrogance, it's just, we see the thing, and we know how to help. And waiting for authorization feels like watching someone need help and doing nothing. She picked up her datapad. Some of us have more trouble sitting with that than others. Genthala said, My party will reach the Northwest Basin by midday tomorrow. Vasquez looked at him. The 4th drainage hollow, he said. First light approach from the north, wind out of the west. He was reading from her marks, which he had apparently memorized while appearing to stand still for the previous 40 minutes. It would be useful to have someone who knew where they were going. Vasquez's expression shifted for the first time in the conversation, very slightly, in a direction Veth Sokar would have categorized as careful. Genthala, Veth Sokar said, with the particular tone of a liaison who knows she is about to be made irrelevant by events she failed to prevent. She would be observing, the huntmaster said, in a consultative capacity. She would not carry Kaldrathi blades, would not participate in the culling, and would not be credited as a participant in the ceremonial record. His dermis had returned to its resting coloration, which in Veth Sokar's experience meant he had finished deciding something. She would walk in the marshland in her legal capacity as garrison personnel and share observations as she found useful. That is precisely what she did today. Yes, he said. And we are going to find 11 diseased animals tomorrow because of it. 3 of those 11 are in advanced stage. The infection would have reached the main herd by the time my party completed the northwest sweep without this. He looked at the post with Vel Sorath's name. I had an apprentice once. The camp was quiet. She goes as an observer, Genthala said. No ceremony, no record. She is simply there. He looked at Vasquez. You would accept those terms? Yes, Vasquez said. She said it immediately, without qualification, without the performance of weighing it. Simply, yes, as if she had already known exactly what terms she would accept and had been waiting for the right person to name them. Veth Sokar stood in the camp under the marshland sky and recognized that she was watching an argument she had constructed, correctly and in good faith, become insufficient in the face of a reality it had not been built to contain. This was not a comfortable recognition. It was, however, an accurate one. She had been a conclave liaison for 11 months and a council administrator for 7 years before that, and she had developed, over that time, a reasonably robust respect for the difference between the two. I will note in my report, she said slowly, that the staff sergeant conducted legal observation fieldwork within the preserve, shared data voluntarily, and was invited to accompany the hunting party in a non-participatory consultative role at the hunt master's discretion. She looked at Vasquez. I will also note that the original denial was not violated. It wasn't, Vasquez said. You were very precise about that. I've read a lot of joint territorial agreements. That is not reassuring. The corner of the human's mouth moved. It was a very small movement, not quite a smile in any expression pattern Veth Sokar was familiar with, but adjacent to one. No, she said. I don't imagine it is. 6 days later, Veth Sokar sat in her liaison office on Outrider Station, writing the formal summary of the hunt's completion. The report was clean. The hunt had closed with a culling count of 37 Reth Val, the highest successful identification in 16 years of recorded hunts. The diseased cohort had been identified and removed with 3 days to spare before the main herd began its northward migration, which meant no follow-on contamination risk and no repeat of what had happened 12 years prior. Gan Thala had submitted his ceremonial completion notation to the Kaldrathi Conclave's seasonal record office, and the record showed 17 hunters. 17, precisely the number authorized by tradition and protocol, no more. It was a clean record. It was accurate in every way that the ceremonial record measured accuracy, which tracked participants, blades, and kills, and did not track the field maps of observers. There was no mention in the ceremonial record of a human observer from the garrison contingent. There was no mention because there had been no human participant. This remained, technically and procedurally, true. Velkaran had asked Veth Sokar, in a private moment after the hunt's completion, whether she thought the staff sergeant had expected to be invited along on the second day. He was the youngest hunter in the party, and was at the age when Kaldrathi hunters began to understand the difference between tradition and necessity, and were still working out how to hold both. Veth Sokar had told him she didn't know, which was honest. She suspected the answer was no. She suspected Nadia Vasquez had gone into the marshland alone because that was the only available path to doing the thing she had gone to do, and that the invitation that followed had been received as confirmation of something she already knew rather than as a reward. But she did not know that. She had not been in the marshland. She had been in her office filing a denial, and then she had been at the eastern camp looking at a map, and by the time she understood what she was looking at, the relevant decisions had already been made. She wrote her summary, filed it, and sat for a moment looking at her office wall, which was covered in the small framed protocol documents that conclave liaisons traditionally displayed: the Joint Territorial Agreement, the Garrison Cooperation Charter, the 17 enumerated points of the Colonial Administrative Code. They were correct documents. They were carefully considered. They had been written by people who understood governance. They had been written, she now understood with a precision she had not possessed 11 months ago, by people who had not understood what a human in wetland terrain was doing when a human was in wetland terrain. Not doing their job, not following protocol, not operating within the institutional framework that had been constructed to contain their enthusiasm. Something older, something that predated the documents and the charter and the council and the agreement and all the careful architecture of interspecies administration. Something that had, on a specific night in the deep basin of the Veth marshland, moved alone through 300 kilometers of reed and water and wind in the dark, reading terrain that it had been reading for 2 million years, and come home with a map. 3 weeks after the hunt closed, a datapad message arrived in her queue from Staff Sergeant Vasquez. The message was brief. It said, "The Reth Val count from this season's census is the highest since records began 32 years ago. Thought you'd want to know." Veth Sokar read the message twice. Then, she looked at the protocol documents on her wall, and at the denial she had filed, and at the 17-point Colonial Administrative Code she had administered faithfully for 11 months. She did not file a response. There was nothing in the administrative code that covered what she was thinking, which was this: Somewhere in the northwest basin of the Veth marshland, a herd of animals was moving north in numbers not seen in 32 years, because a human who had been told no had gone anyway, alone, into the dark and the reeds and the wind, and done exactly what she was built to do. Not for ceremony, not for credit, simply because the thing needed doing, and she had known how, and in the end, that had been reason enough. She saved the message. She sat for a long time at her desk. Outside her office window, the marshland extended to the horizon in the flat gray light of the outrider morning. 300 kilometers of reed and water that looked from here like nothing much. She had never managed to find it beautiful. She thought maybe that was a failure of perspective, and that perspective, once you identified its gaps, was not always easy to fill. The message indicator on her datapad blinked once, then settled. No reply. No follow-up. The staff sergeant did not ask for confirmation that the message had been received. She already knew it had.